Good evening. My name is Joshua Hall. I am an environmental health specialist at the Arkansas Department of Environmental Health, where my focus is on environmental justice. It's a true honor to be able to talk with you all today about something that I've always been so passionate about. Environmental health has been something that I've spent a lot of time on. And for many years now, I've taken a particular liking to the field of environmental justice. So, what is environmental justice? The EPA defines it as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. It stems from the idea that everyone, no matter what race, what income, should be able to go and enjoy a sustainable environment and not have to fight more environmental hazards than anyone else does. The environmental justice movement began in the late 1970s in a responsive sort to the civil rights movement just a decade before. One of the first examples of a scenario involving environmental justice was in 1979. As a waste management company applied to put a level 1 solid waste facility in East Houston, Texas. The Texas Department of Health approved this permit, but the residents in the area filed a lawsuit to protest the permit being issued, claiming that the placement of the landfill was motivated in part by racial discrimination. While the residents didn't win this lawsuit, it laid the foundation for more discussion on environmental justice that would take place in the years after around the country. In fact, just 3 years after the Texas case, there was another incident, this time in Warren County, North Carolina. It was in response to a highly toxic PCB landfill being granted a permit to be built in a predominantly African American community. The people living in that community organized a nonviolent protest, alleging that the reason their community was picked to host this toxic landfill was due to its predominantly minority population and low income status. These protests paved the way for more research on the topic of environmental justice, beginning with the 1984 publication by the General Accounting Office, or the GAO. In this research, the GAO found that communities that had higher percentages of racial minority population had to deal with more waste and pollutants than did the rest of the country. Soon after the GAO study, the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ did a more comprehensive investigation that was titled Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. This study found a substantial relationship between the location of these hazardous waste storage facilities, or landfills, and the communities that had a higher minority population. After the UCC's research, the environmental justice movement began to gain even more steam. In fact, Arkansas was one of the first to acknowledge environmental justice, passing Act 1263 in 1993. This act aimed to include environmental equity in all siting decisions for high-impact solid waste management facilities. The environmental justice movement reached a peak in 1994, with President Bill Clinton signing the Executive Order 12898. This executive order established a working group for environmental justice and mandated that federal agencies consider environmental justice in the planning, the development, and the implementation stages of any policy or regulation that it considered. Since you now have some background about environmental justice, I'd like to talk about the impact that it has on a community. Overall, it's minority groups and low-income populations that are the most targeted by acts of environmental injustice, and also the ones that benefit the most from environmental justice. This comes from studies conducted by groups like the GAO and the UCC, which consistently found a correlation between a community having a higher percentage of their population as racial minorities and whether or not they had a commercial waste facility in the community. In 2007, the UCC followed up their original research with a study titled Toxic Waste and Race at 20, investigating the changes in environmental injustice over the past 20 years, ranging from 1987 to 2007. At that time, it concluded that neighborhoods that had a commercial waste facility averaging 56% of their population as a minority, while those without a commercial waste facility average only 30% of their population as a minority. A term that's used quite a bit in this area that I think that you should be aware of is the term of environmental racism. Environmental racism is defined as the intentional or the unintentional targeting of minority communities or the exclusion of minority groups from public or private boards. Much of what I've stated about minority communities is also true about low-income populations. In fact, neighborhoods with commercial waste facilities have, on average, a 1.5 times higher poverty rate than those communities without those facilities. There are many ways that environmental justice can impact a community. But today I'm just going to go over a few specifically in an effort to keep us from being here all night. The impacts that I've chosen to go over are the health of the community, the housing situation in the community, and the transportation methods in the community as areas that environmental justice impacts. We'll start with the way that environmental justice impacts the health in a community. One example of this involves the access and the affordability of healthier food options within a community. Environmental justice would ensure that all individuals in that community can access fresh fruits and vegetables or healthier food options, typically from their local grocery store or market. This would be a huge impact on the community if there were no grocery store in a particular community within the area, because it would mean that that group would not have access as easily to the fresh fruits and vegetables. Another example is if the healthier options were simply unaffordable for low-income communities. Take, for example, if those healthier foods were priced higher than the community could afford, then it could lead the community to eat fast food or more processed foods just to remain on their budget, forgetting about the healthy aspects. This type of diet would create even more issues for the community down the road, as they wouldn't be getting the nutrients that they need. A second way environmental justice can impact a community is through the community's housing. Typically, the most well-known example of this is through the use of lead in paint. Lead was used in paint because it made the paint cover a greater space, which meant that less of the paint was needed in order to cover the entire house. Using lead paint in low-income communities was a commonplace in the mid-20th century. Well, at least until it was banned from household use in 1978. Even though there were a growing number of health risks that had been identified from exposure. The final example of how environmental justice can impact a community is through the community's transportation methods. And many of these regard public transportation. It's quite imperative that all individuals in a community find a way to access some method of transportation so that they can find employment, therefore they can receive a paycheck, and then be able to support their family. So if an individual is relying on a public bus to take him or her to the office, the changing of the fare or the route of the bus would equal an environmental injustice because it would make it no longer accessible for the member of that community, or perhaps for the community as a whole, depending on the drastic nature of the change. An impact of environmental justice would be implementing a policy that ensured the fair and equal access by all the people in that region or that community, regardless of their income level or their birthplace or location or any particular factor. It is essential to consider the mitigation techniques before changes are implemented, though, as there might be barriers that prevent a certain individual that may not have been considered originally by the agency or the board implementing the regulation. Now that we've discussed what environmental justice is and how it can impact a community, I bet you're wondering what you can do in eliminating these injustices from your community and ensuring that environmental justice is what is used. Well, the first way to do this is to stay informed of the issues in your area. The EPA has developed 2 resources to assist you with this. One is called EnviroFacts, which you'll see more of on the next slide. The second is the EJ Screen, which is on the slide following that. Outside of those 2, it is important for individuals to get involved in their community and be prepared to advocate on behalf of your community if there is a proposal or a regulation that would be bringing some type of environmental injustice to your community, which is quite plausible in today's day and age. Another thing that you can do is to hold those around you accountable. Agencies and lawmakers sometimes each fail to see the personalized perspective of the residents in an area. So it's quite important to be able to communicate your perspective to them regarding their proposal. This is what the webpage EnviroFacts looks like that's put out by the EPA. It's one of the sources that gives citizens a chance to search the issues in their area. And using this information, individuals may be able to better participate in their community advocacy, including the administration of guidance documents and regulations that are published from the federal government. EJ Screen, which is the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool, as seen here, is the newer tool that is provided by the EPA. It allows screening and a map service so that you can search for a specific location and view what risks or environmental justice concerns exist in that area. I like to finish up with what goals that have been set specifically regarding environmental justice in the future. Recently, the EPA released the Environmental Justice 2020, a report detailing the goals for the future in the field. In Environmental Justice 2020, the EPA lists the goals it expects to work on between 2016 and 2020 and its visions for these years. Specifically, the vision includes integrating environmental justice into all acts, cultivating strong partnerships to improve on-the-ground results, charting a path forward for better achieving environmental outcomes, and reducing disparities in the nation's most overburdened communities. Just to recap, environmental justice is the fair treatment and the meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice can impact a community in many different ways. Examples of these include equal access of healthy and affordable food, housing situations like lead paint, and transportation methods like public buses or roadway repairs. And we can each work to eliminate environmental injustices in our community by staying informed, getting involved, and staying accountable. On the next two slides, I have attached my list of references that were used in preparing this presentation. I sincerely appreciate you having me here to speak on the environmental justice topic, and I really do commend you for how great of an audience that you have been. At this time, I would like to open the floor for questions about anything that I have covered in this presentation. And I have listed my contact information on this slide, should you not think of a question now, but wish to contact me later. Thanks again.